Detective John Caulfield looked upon Alexandria, Louisiana, with an expression etched somewhere between melancholy and steel-hard determination. His eyes, ancient but lit with an inscrutable spark, absorbed the languid cityscape. Around him, old structures slouched under the weight of history, whispers of past eras blending with the fervent pulse of modernity. Alexandria's verdant cloak of moss and fern was a deceptive veil over its teeming heart of intrigue and secrets, just like the bayou it inhabited. Within this twilight metropolis, he was drawn to the Grand Alexandria Museum of Art, a kaleidoscope of culture and anachronism. The facade of the museum held the wisdom of the ages, its granite eyes gazing upon the city with a knowing stare, as if privy to its darkest corners. The scent of time, musty old paper, and worn-out artifacts wafted through its ornate halls, mingling with the lingering, vibrant aroma of fresh paint and modern art, a perfect Eden echoing the city it stood within and hiding serpents beneath its veneer. Caulfield was here not for the art, but for a shadowy affair that tainted its sacred chambers. Blackmail had slithered into the Eden of culture, tainting its sanctity. Several of the city's prominent citizens had fallen prey, all of them linked, however distantly, to this very museum. It was in one such gloomy chamber, an exhibit on colonial history, where John found the first thread of a much larger tapestry. The chamber, bathed in the dim glow of ambient lights, showcased old maps, artifacts, and the predatory past of civilization. Here, tucked away in an unassuming corner, lay an artifact, a weathered journal that revealed more than just history. It spoke of a bizarre gathering, of whispers in dark corners and the feasting of an odd fraternity. "Are you all right, detective?" The museum curator, Ms. Leclerc, her face chiseled with the sharp angles of concern, disturbed his inspection. "Indeed, just lost in thought," he replied, taking care to keep the journal concealed. Her concern seemed authentic, but John, hardened by years of detective work, knew better than to make hasty judgments. He engaged Ms. Leclerc in a conversation about the museum's history, the mundane tedium of administration, and the strange occurrences around town. As the conversation danced around different topics, he introduced the issue at hand. His words, though cloaked in subtlety, aimed to probe any knowledge she might have about the victims. Leclerc, for her part, responded with shock and sympathy, but offered little else. However, she did share intriguing folklore about an old local cult that once held sway over the city's elite during the colonial era. Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of fear and fascination as she narrated stories of bizarre rituals and forgotten gods. Despite the passing of centuries, the chilling narrative survived in whispers and fearful glances. He felt a chill run down his spine as he listened. His heart pounded, not from fear but a sense of revelation. The old detective's gaze turned back to the museum, now casting long shadows in the evening light. Could the grand monument of culture and history also be a breeding ground for secrets darker than the blackest of bayous? Only time would tell. In the quiet solitude of his rented room later that evening, he pored over the cryptic journal and his notes, assembling pieces of a grotesque puzzle. This was more than just a case of blackmail, he realized, as he traced the symbol of a beast from the journal with his fingers. Too many eyes, too many mouths. His journey into this shadowy affair was just beginning, leading him deeper into the serpent's nest. The words of a long-forgotten poet echoed in his mind as he looked out into the quiet, dimly lit streets of Alexandria. "Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive." As the echoes of the day faded into the stillness of the night, he prepared himself for the unraveling of this tangled web, ignorant of the cosmic horrors that awaited him in the heart of the Eden of culture. John stepped into another day, the sun casting long shadows as it emerged over Alexandria. His morning was dedicated to combing through the annals of the city's history, delving into the centuries-old layers of dust and parchment. The musty scent was a welcome contrast to the humid air outside. It was inside the cavernous depths of Alexandria's oldest library that the links in the chain of his investigation began to connect. The blackmail victims were not just pillars of the community. They were also benefactors of the museum, patrons of art and culture. As he learned more about them, he found a peculiar similarity that unsettled him. All had an inexplicable interest in the old colonial cult, its forgotten god, and its obscure rituals. The artifacts they donated bore the symbol he had seen in the journal, the grotesque beast. The very thought sent an icy prickle crawling down his spine. As the detective dug deeper into the archives, his investigation morphed into an archaeological excavation of the city's shadowy underbelly. The further he dug, the darker the shadows grew. Stories of the cult's cannibalistic rites surfaced from beneath the layers of forgotten tales, like decomposing remains rising from a shallow grave. The grotesque image it painted in his mind was enough to turn his stomach. He met with each victim, his questions cloaked in the subtlety of casual conversations. But he found himself surrounded by the wall of denial or ignorance, a barrier of silence erected by fear or complicity. Yet their eyes told a different tale. There was a familiar glint, a haunted reflection that came from seeing things one shouldn't have. As night fell, he found himself in the company of an elderly victim, Mrs. Devereaux, a woman of refined tastes and old money. Her grand house, standing stoic among the sprawling oaks, breathed an air of antiquity, much like herself. "My family's been part of Alexandria since the beginning, detective," she shared, her voice a whispery echo that seemed to blend with the creaks and sighs of her ancestral home. She told him stories of the past, her narrative punctuated with vivid descriptions of grand feasts and strange traditions. Every tale danced around the periphery of something darker, never venturing too far into the shadow. The old woman's eyes held a look he recognized, a mix of fear and something else. It was akin to what a devotee might have in the presence of their god, a trembling reverence. She showed him a relic, an antique brooch bearing the dreadful symbol of the cult. Her fingers trembled as she held it, as if it were both a precious heirloom and a loathsome creature. "I suppose it's just a reminder of old times," she murmured, "of how things used to be before we became civilized." There was a quiver in her voice, a bitter smile on her face that hinted at a secret understanding of the word. He left the Devereaux mansion with the brooch in his pocket, a heavy token of a reality he was just beginning to understand. The world he thought he knew was disassembling, replaced by a tapestry woven from threads of dread and abhorrent rituals, all under the vast indifferent shadow of the old gods. As the veil of night fell over Alexandria, he returned to his room, the brooch burning a hole in his pocket. He was no longer just a detective chasing down blackmailers. He was an explorer, charting his course through the murky waters of cosmic horror, pushing deeper into the shadow of the old gods, even as their grotesque forms loomed large on the horizon of his investigation. As the threads of the investigation began to intertwine into a dark tapestry, Detective John Caulfield found himself standing on the precipice of an abyss. His search for truth led him towards a confrontation with the cult itself, the serpent lurking within Alexandria's Eden. He received an invitation to an elite gathering, a feast of the Ebon Tide, a shrouded reference, he suspected, to the cult's grotesque rituals. He approached the event with the steely resolve of a man who had seen the face of a tornado and lived to tell the tale. The venue, a sprawling mansion set on the outskirts of Alexandria, pulsed with an uncanny rhythm. Its opulent architecture and sprawling gardens masked the horror beneath, much like the city it stood within. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a shudder run down his spine, a premonition of the cosmic horror that awaited within. The feast was a pageantry of the macabre, a grotesque display of opulence and dread. Beneath the veneer of cultured conversation and laughter, he saw the primal fear and manic exhilaration in the eyes of the attendees. The air was charged with a dark anticipation, a sentiment shared by all in attendance. "The Feast of the Ebon Tide isn't just a gathering, detective," whispered a voice beside him. It was Mrs. Devereaux, her eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of terror and delight. "It's a communion with powers far beyond our understanding." He swallowed hard, his palms clammy against the stem of his untouched wine glass. As he moved through the opulent rooms, he observed the guests, recognizing many of the faces from his investigation. Their normalcy, their sophistication, was like a chilling mockery in the face of the revelations he'd uncovered. As the night deepened, the true nature of the feast emerged. The revelry gave way to a horrific spectacle that defied all bounds of civilization. a cannibalistic ritual performed with a reverence that turned his stomach. As the victims were led in, their faces masked with terror, the crowd's exhilaration crescendoed into a fervor that was palpably abhorrent. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the macabre scene unfold. He had faced the terror of the tornado, the wrath of nature at its most devastating. But this was a terror of a different kind, a terror born of man's capacity for monstrous acts in the name of forgotten gods. Despite his revulsion, he remained recording the horror in his mind, recognizing faces, noting every detail. He was a man under a mission, driven by the desire to unveil the terrible secret of Alexandria, no matter how abominable. But as he retreated into the shadows to escape the gruesome spectacle, he couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. In the terrifying stillness of the night that followed, he came to the realization that he was no longer merely observing the horror, but was now a part of it. As he walked back to his room, the chilling laughter and the grotesque scenes of the feast echoed in his mind, marking the beginning of his descent into the realm of cosmic horror. Every shadow seemed to hold lurking nightmares. The stars, usually a comfort, now seemed to mock his insignificance in the cosmic scheme. As he entered his room, the dread was a living, breathing entity, consuming the space around him. This was no ordinary investigation. He was now a pawn in a game played by ancient gods, their indifference as terrifying as their worshippers' fervor. As sleep eluded him, he found himself contemplating his next move, knowing full well that the darkness was closing in. As the sun rose over Alexandria, the city's Eden-like facade stood in stark contrast to the horrors he had witnessed. He woke not from sleep, but from a daze of restless contemplation. His dreams had been haunted by the abominable feast, and the reality he awoke to was not much better. His day was a blur of confrontations and revelations. He approached those he had seen at the feast, his accusations met with derision, denial, and thinly veiled threats. He felt the net tightening around him. His investigation had poked the serpent, and it was rearing its head. Undeterred, he pressed on, navigating the web of lies and deceit. Each denial, each threat was merely confirmation of the ghastly truth. He collected evidence, documenting everything in meticulous detail. As the day waned, he sent his compiled findings to an old friend in the bureau, attaching a note. "The serpent is real." He also reached out to a journalist acquaintance, spilling details of the horrors hidden beneath Alexandria's cultured veneer. His narrative echoed with the chilling details of cannibalistic feasts, hidden cults, and dreadful gods. Even as he unloaded his evidence, he felt the suffocating embrace of the cult tightening. Fear was no stranger to him, but what he felt was not merely the fear of his impending doom. It was the fear of the unknown, the realization of how insignificant he was in the grand cosmic scheme. As night fell, he found himself in the grand halls of the museum, the heart of the cult's activity. The artifacts around him, once symbols of culture and heritage, now seemed to mock him with their dreadful secret. He walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing his impending doom. In the silence of the museum, he encountered Ms. Leclerc. Her face held a twisted sense of delight and regret. "You've seen too much, detective," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "And you've done too much," he retorted, his words laced with a grim resignation. What transpired next was not a chase, but a procession. The cult had awoken, its members surrounding him with an eerie calm. They were not monsters, but ordinary people caught in the clutch of cosmic horror. The realization chilled him more than the prospect of his end. As he was led to the center of the museum, to the grotesque statue of their many-eyed, many-mouthed god, he made his peace. His evidence was out there, the city's dark secret bared. The fear in their eyes confirmed his suspicion. They were not merely his executioners. They were witnesses to their own downfall. The detective's demise was not marked by the crack of a gunshot or the spilling of blood. Instead, it was a hushed event, shrouded in eerie reverence. John Caulfield, the last witness to Alexandria's dark secret, was offered to the indifferent god, his life extinguished in the shadow of cosmic horror. As the morning sun bled into the sky, the city of Alexandria woke to scandalous headlines. His evidence had found its way into the world, stirring the sleepy city. The serpent had been exposed, its hissing echoing through the shocked populace. But amidst the upheaval, the Grand Museum stood silent, its granite eyes holding 1,000 stories. It stood as the final witness to his sacrifice, the man who faced the cosmic horror lurking within Alexandria's Eden and paid the price for truth. His legacy, the exposure of the macabre secret, lived on, even as his story ended under the indifferent gaze of the old gods. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed our content, show your support with a like and subscribe, and stay notified by hitting the bell icon. Expect more cosmic horror from Eldritch Tales Factory, and feel free to explore our other stories. See you in the next video.